The Galactic Council had never imagined they'd need the help of a mere human. But as the universe trembled on the brink of war, desperate times had led to a desperate call. And there, standing in a room filled with alien delegates, a single human, James Hargrove, was being asked to babysit the galaxy's future. "I'm sorry, what?" James blinked, still trying to grasp the situation. He'd been summoned to a high-level council meeting aboard a massive starship, expecting diplomatic talks or at the very least some sort of peace negotiation. Instead, they wanted him to play babysitter. "You heard correctly," a reptilian figure across the table said, his voice rasping like gravel. The Nyran Alliance, a species known for their unparalleled strength and intellect, have, well, a delicate matter to attend to. Their young have begun showing signs of unpredictable power. We require a neutral party, someone without the potential for manipulation, someone human. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, the other alien delegates casting nervous glances at one another. They weren't used to humans, let alone one human, being in such an important role. James looked around, expecting someone to burst out laughing. The idea of a human, someone barely out of his 20s, standing at the helm of such a delicate mission seemed ludicrous. But the faces around him were deadly serious. "You're suggesting I babysit alien children?" James said, his voice incredulous. "Are you out of your minds?" The alien called Zekar, a towering figure with glowing purple skin, leaned forward. "You underestimate the gravity of this situation, Earthling. The Nyran are the most powerful species in the galaxy. Their young are unpredictable, volatile. Their powers are beyond anything we've ever encountered. If you fail, it could spell disaster for the galaxy." James scoffed, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "So, you want me to babysit aliens with godlike abilities? You know, without accidentally destroying everything?" "Yeah, no pressure." A low chuckle emanated from another corner of the room. The Zorkian, a being with 6 eyes and skin like liquid silver, spoke up. "You humans are known for your resilience. You have survived the most perilous of situations, overcoming insurmountable odds. The Council believes you are uniquely suited for this task." James stared at the table, still processing the absurdity of the situation. He'd only been on a few diplomatic missions before, mostly listening to alien leaders argue over trivial issues. And now? Now, they wanted him to babysit alien toddlers who could likely level planets with a thought. Before he could respond, the voice of a young girl cut through the tension. "What's happening? Are you sending him away?" All eyes turned toward the source of the voice. A small, humanoid alien child, no older than 6 in human years, stood at the entrance. Her pale green skin shimmered in the low light, and her large eyes were filled with curiosity, yet behind them, there was something ancient. Unpredictable. Dangerous. The room stiffened. James felt his pulse quicken. This was one of the Nyran children, the very beings he was supposed to babysit. Her telekinetic powers were well known, but it was the intensity of her presence that unnerved him. "Lyra, you shouldn't be here," Zekar said, his voice tinged with urgency. "Return to your quarters immediately." The child ignored him, walking toward James with slow, deliberate steps. The tension in the room thickened as she stopped in front of him, looking up at him with those unnervingly wise eyes. She reached up a tiny hand, fingers trembling slightly as she touched his sleeve. James froze, his heart racing. He didn't know what to expect from this alien child. She could snap him in half with a thought if she so desired. But what struck him the most was the sadness in her eyes, a deep sorrow that felt all too human. "Are you going to protect me?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable weight. There was something about her, something that pulled at his heartstrings. He'd been in tough situations before, but this was different. He wasn't just dealing with political games or wars between species. He was being asked to protect a child, one who might be far more dangerous than any human or alien he'd ever met. "Protect you?" James whispered, his mind racing. I don't know if I'm the right person for this." The child's lips curled into a small, almost imperceptible smile. I think you are. A deep sense of responsibility welled up in James. His training had always focused on diplomacy and peace, never child-rearing, especially not children who could wipe out entire civilizations. But her words hung in the air like a challenge. Fine, James said, his voice more confident than he felt. I'll do it. But you're going to make this easy on me, right? The child didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away, her tiny form disappearing down the hallway as silently as she had appeared. Zekar nodded solemnly. It's settled, then. We'll provide all the resources you need. Be prepared, this will be no easy task. But we have faith in your resilience, Earthling. As the door slid shut behind him, James exhaled deeply. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but one thing was clear, he had just signed up for something far bigger than himself. And as the hum of the starship enveloped him, he couldn't help but wonder, could one human really stand between a galaxy on the edge of chaos and a child who held the fate of all worlds in her tiny hands? James sat in his small quarters aboard the starship, the hum of the engines a constant backdrop to his swirling thoughts. The Council had given him the task, but they hadn't provided much in the way of guidance. No instructions. No manuals on babysitting galaxy-shattering alien children. It was as if they expected him to just figure it out. He glanced at the small data pad in his hand, displaying the profile of Lyra, the Nyran child. There were only a few details listed, her age, a general description of her abilities, and a vague warning about her potential for uncontrollable power. It was the kind of profile that made you wonder whether sending her to school or locking her in a containment cell would be a better option. He sighed, rubbing his temples. He'd survived a lifetime of absurd situations. But this one? This felt different. It felt like a test he wasn't sure he could pass. His door chimed before he could get lost in his thoughts. Without waiting for a response, it slid open, revealing Lyra. She stood there, the soft glow of her skin reflecting the artificial light of the hallway. She was small, perhaps no taller than a human child, but there was something unmistakably ancient about her eyes, as if her mind and experiences stretched far beyond her years. You came, she said softly, her voice holding the same weight as her gaze. James couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. She had no control over what she was. She was a child, but she wasn't. In the universe, this council had placed her fate in his hands. I didn't know what to expect, he admitted, stepping aside to let her in. But here you are. Lyra's eyes flickered over the room, absorbing the strange technology that surrounded her. It's not like home, she muttered, as if the words weren't meant for him. She was only speaking the truth, and yet, it made James feel like a foreigner in his own space. Nothing's like home, James replied, his voice softer than he intended. Not for me, either. She tilted her head, her large eyes narrowing slightly as she studied him. You're afraid, she observed. James froze, a lump forming in his throat. No. I'm not afraid. Lyra's expression softened into something almost like pity. You should be. The words hung in the air like a weight, and James tried to shake off the unease creeping through his chest. I'm here to help you, he said, though it sounded weak even to his own ears. You can't help me, Lyra said quietly, moving toward a chair in the corner of the room. She climbed onto it with the grace of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. They think I'm just a child. But I'm not. You don't understand. None of you do. Her voice cracked slightly as she said the last words, and for the first time, James saw the fragility hidden beneath her intimidating exterior. It was a fleeting moment, but it was enough to stir something within him. He was supposed to protect her, but who would protect her from herself? I know you're not just a child, James replied, sitting down across from her. His eyes softened. But you don't have to carry the weight of the universe alone. Not anymore. Lyra's gaze met his, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. It was as though the silence between them carried 1,000 unspoken words, a tension neither of them could fully escape. Then, As though breaking the spell, Lyra stood abruptly, her small hands gripping the chair's edge. Her whole body tensed, and James felt the atmosphere in the room shift. The air itself seemed to vibrate, as if the walls of the ship were closing in on them. Her eyes widened with sudden fear, or was it anger? James couldn't tell. I didn't mean to, Lyra stammered, her voice tinged with panic. Before James could react, the lights in the room flickered, and a loud crack sounded above them. The ceiling trembled as if something massive had just collided with the ship. The room went silent. "Did you feel that?" James asked, his pulse quickening. Lyra's eyes were wild now, her breath coming in short gasps. She didn't answer, her hands shaking as if fighting for control. James stood quickly, crossing the room to her side. "Lyra, what's happening?" "I don't know," she cried out, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean to." The ship's intercom came to life, the voice of the captain cutting through the panic. "This is the captain. We are under attack. All crew members to their stations. I repeat, we are under attack. Get to safety immediately." James's heart pounded in his chest. He turned back to Lyra, who looked up at him with wide, frightened eyes. "I didn't mean to, but they'll come for me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're already here." Before James could respond, a flash of light lit up the hallway outside. The walls shook again, but this time, it wasn't just the ship. Someone was coming for them. And Lyra knew it. The sound of footsteps echoed, growing louder. James didn't have time to think. He grabbed Lyra by the arm, pulling her toward the door. "We need to move. Now." And as the door slammed open, James realized this was no longer about babysitting. This was about survival. James' pulse thundered in his ears as he yanked Lyra toward the escape route, her small hand trembling in his grasp. The intercom crackled again, the captain's voice slicing through the tension. "All crew members, brace for impact. We're under attack, repeat, we're under attack. Prepare for emergency maneuvers." The ship's corridors stretched before them, cold and sterile, but now there was an unnatural silence, a heavy, suffocating silence. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, disjointed shadows. James could feel the ship's hull shudder beneath his boots, the tremors growing stronger. Lyra's eyes darted around, her breath shallow, her expression a mix of fear and something else, something darker. "They're not just attacking the ship," she whispered, barely audible. "They're hunting me." James stopped in his tracks, his grip tightening instinctively on her arm. "Who's hunting you?" He forced the question out, though he feared the answer. Lyra swallowed hard, her voice cracking. "The Canary. They're a warlord faction. They've been after me for years. Ever since I was born." James' heart lurched. The Canary were notorious, a brutal empire that had conquered countless star systems, wiping out entire populations. And now they were coming for her. "Why?" James demanded, urgency in his voice. "What do they want with you?" Her lips trembled as she looked up at him. "I'm not just a child. I'm a weapon." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but there was no mistaking the weight in her words. "My people, they can't control me. I'm too powerful." James felt a chill run down his spine. "Then we need to get you out of here. We need to find a way to." Before he could finish, the ship shook again, more violently this time, sending them both stumbling against the wall. The corridor lights flickered again, leaving only brief flashes of illumination. The walls groaned with the strain of the ship's instability. Lyra gasped, clutching her chest. "They're here," she whispered. James didn't need her to say anything more. He knew it. The feeling in the air was palpable. An invisible force pressing down, thick with the promise of destruction. Without another word, he pulled her along, faster now, toward the nearest escape pod. Each step felt heavier as the ship seemed to grow more unstable, every turn in the hallway stretching longer than the last. They reached the docking bay, only to find it empty. Panic surged through James as he glanced around, but there was no time to dwell on it. "Where are they?" Lyra asked, her voice trembling now, the weight of the moment bearing down on her. James scanned the bay. The pod sat idle in the corner. He didn't hesitate. "Get in," he ordered, his voice firm. Lyra hesitated for a fraction of a second, eyes darting nervously toward the far corner of the room, but then she nodded, her fear giving way to trust. She rushed to the pod, climbing inside. James's eyes locked on the door, instinct telling him they weren't alone. He quickly keyed in the launch sequence. But before the pod could seal, a noise rang through the bay, a soft footfall. Too soft. A figure emerged from the shadows at the far end of the room. A figure cloaked in dark armor, eyes gleaming with malice. Lyra froze, her hand hovering over the pod's control panel. "No," she whispered. "Not them. Please." The Canary soldier stood motionless, his eyes trained on Lyra. The coldness in his gaze was enough to make James's blood run cold. This was no ordinary soldier. The man, or whatever it was taller than a human, its features obscured by a black helmet, but the insignia on his chest left no doubt. "Move," James growled, his hand instinctively reaching for the sidearm strapped to his waist. The Canary didn't flinch, didn't even acknowledge the movement. Instead, his lips parted in a smile that sent a chill rippling through James's spine. "You cannot escape, child," the soldier said in a voice that was cold, mechanical. "The Canary will have what is ours." Lyra's eyes flashed with terror. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm not the weapon you think I am. I'm—" But the Canary soldier cut her off with a sharp, guttural laugh. "Your words mean nothing. You are power. You are ours to control." James's instincts screamed at him to act. He couldn't wait any longer. He swung his weapon toward the soldier. "Get back." The Canary soldier moved with a speed that defied logic. In one fluid motion, he was standing right in front of James, knocking the weapon from his hands and sending him sprawling to the ground. The sound of metal clanging against metal reverberated through the bay as James tried to scramble to his feet. Lyra screamed in fear, her small form pressing herself against the pod as if it could somehow shield her from the soldier's presence. The Canary soldier's hand shot out, grabbing James by the collar and lifting him off the ground with terrifying ease. "Your human strength is insignificant," he sneered. "It will not stop what is inevitable." James fought against the grip, desperation clawing at his chest. "You don't know anything," he hissed. "You think you control her? You think you have power?" The soldier's smile faded, his grip tightening. "I don't need to control her. I need to break her." And with that, the world around James seemed to spin, his thoughts consumed by the overwhelming fear for Lyra's safety. She wasn't just a weapon. She was his responsibility now. And he wasn't going to let them take her without a fight. As the soldier raised his weapon, the ship trembled once more. The walls of the ship groaned as if they were alive, stretching with every violent shudder that rattled through the metal. The Canary soldier's grip tightened around James's collar, lifting him higher as if he were nothing more than a rag doll. His breath came in short, frantic bursts as he struggled to break free, every muscle screaming in protest. But the Canary was a mountain of muscle and indifference. James's eyes darted to the pod where Lyra stood frozen, her face pale with fear, hands shaking at her sides. "You won't take her," James gasped, his voice low and strained as he fought to stay conscious, feeling the blood rush to his head. "She's not what you think she is." The soldier's dark helmet tilted, as if considering his words. "I do not need to understand her to control her," he rasped, his voice distorted, like it was coming through a filter. "The Canary do not tolerate disobedience. You will learn that shortly." James's vision blurred, but he couldn't stop. He refused to die here, not like this. Not when Lyra was still in danger. Every instinct within him screamed to act. His fingers twitched, finding the hidden blade inside his jacket. With a savage jerk, he yanked it free, plunging it into the soldier's side with all the force he could muster. For a moment, the soldier didn't even flinch. Then, with an inhuman growl, he shoved James away, sending him crashing into the floor. The blade clattered to the side, useless. Blood, black as oil, began to seep through the soldier's armor, but the wound didn't slow him. The Canari's armored fingers twitched, and the air around them grew heavy, charged with a dangerous energy. Lyra's voice broke the stillness, her trembling words sharp with desperation. "James, get up. You can't stop him. We're dead if you don't listen." James groaned, pushing himself up with difficulty, the cold floor slick under his palms. His chest burned from the impact, but he couldn't afford to stay down. "Not now." "Then what the hell do you expect me to do?" he snapped, dragging himself to his feet. His eyes locked on the Canari soldier, who was advancing, his weapon now drawn, a sleek, glowing blade. The soldier's eyes flashed behind the helmet, glowing a faint crimson. "You can die quickly, or you can die slowly. Your choice." Lyra stepped forward, her body trembling with every move. She was trying to be brave, but the fear was evident in her eyes. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice quiet but resolute. "I'm not the weapon you think I am." She took a breath, and James saw her shoulders shake. "I never was." The Canari soldier froze, his attention snapping to her. There was a flicker of confusion, but it was gone too quickly. "What are you saying?" he growled. Lyra's voice hardened, cutting through the tension like a blade. "I was born into this. But I'm not theirs anymore. I have control now. Over my power. Over my future." The soldier laughed, a sound that was more mechanical than anything human. "You lie. You cannot control what is beyond you." "Watch me," Lyra whispered. In that moment, the air seemed to shift. The very space around them crackled with a sudden surge of energy, so powerful that the lights flickered, the hum of the ship's engines stuttering as if the universe itself was holding its breath. James watched in stunned disbelief as Lyra's eyes glowed, a bright, unsettling light. Her body shimmered with an ethereal aura, a presence so overwhelming that the Canari soldier stumbled back in shock. She was no longer the frightened girl James had tried to protect. She was something else, something more. With a primal roar, the Canari soldier lunged at her, his weapon raised to strike. But Lyra was faster. She lifted her hands, and the air seemed to bend around them. In a flash of bright light, the soldier was thrown back, crashing into the far wall with a sickening crunch. The room shook with the force of it. Lyra stood still, breathing heavily, but her eyes never left the fallen soldier. "I am not your weapon," she said, her voice soft, yet filled with an undeniable authority. "I never was." James stared, a mix of awe and fear flooding his veins. "Lyra, what did you just—" "I told you," she said quietly, turning to face him, her expression now unreadable. "I'm the one who decides what happens next. Not them." The silence that followed was deafening. The Canari soldier lay unmoving, his chest heaving with unnatural gasps, but he was no longer a threat. James felt his knees give way beneath him, and he sank to the floor, his head spinning. The last few moments had felt like a fever dream, but now, the weight of reality began to settle on his shoulders. Lyra's eyes softened as she approached him, her energy returning to a more human level. "We're not out of this yet," she said, her voice quieter now. "But we're closer." The ship trembled again, this time in response to the sound of distant explosions, an unmistakable sign that the Canari fleet was closing in. They hadn't won yet. But they were no longer powerless. And James knew, deep down, that the fight had only just begun. "Let's go," he said, standing with her help. "We've got one shot at this. And I'm not wasting it." They moved toward the pod, but this time, there was something different in the air, a sense of determination, a new spark in Lyra's eyes. Whatever the future held, it wasn't the Canari who would control it. Not anymore. And that thought made all the difference.